Yes.
Yeah.
Now, probably right now.
So to some degree, where it naturalized the conversation between us, but the underlying premise was it naturalized living and dying as part of our life process, not as some theory, but as perceptively when we created a framework where we are who we were, and what we are discussing is an alternative dimension in life that's parallel to everyday living, and that is the perception that living and dying are intertwined in life. The framework or the fear of it is death,
Mhm.
but you see that somehow once something happens to you, become aware even how your body works, and you see the body's juggling act, the immune system's juggling act, the how it's a cooperative, and then sometimes it's a competitive, and but then you become aware of dimensions of your own life that were taken for granted, but one is introduced to. And I almost experience sometimes where there is a pain that happens or a problem that happens, which is almost like a breaking up of a love affair.
Hmm.
Uh, Somehow, the, uh, the feeling that you have is an accurate feeling. It's almost as if my aching foot or my aching leg or even my cancer was requiring an affectionate feeling for it. Not schmaltz or whatever, but seeing it from a different place and not seeing it from continuing and fixing it up so I can do this again and do that again, and
Right.
but seeing the interruption as a profound thing
Mm.
has caused one to be aware of a few other dimensions in one's
Mm.
life
Mhm.
that are coexisting, and they're not so much also based on doing, but they're more coming from being.
Yeah.
And so then you see that somehow it's left us with a year or two of what we've attempted to reach philosophically anyway, seeing the world from being, where the pressure to survive is not the dominating feature, but it is a feature. But you understand that there is, in fact, you see the energy somehow running through the story. And then you see the story.
Mhm.
And then you, if in fact one can be still enough to see it from that perspective, you see that there's alongside history, there's been mystery. And if you were there at historical times, you would have seen the so called history from a different perspective, having been there.
Yeah.
Hmm? Okay. So you see then that that perspective is missing
Mm.
in the moment, and it is discovered maybe in retrospect. What were the underlying features that were taking place? What was happening? You start to see that people are moving in their own movies also. So when they try to figure out a crime that happened, they say, what was happening to the person's family at that time? Where was he? Was he under stress? So they're measuring it as if they're taking a temperature to see the level of reaction and to see socially what was taking place. And, and socially, you find some sort of loneliness running through the story. Um, a no lifer. In other words, no matter what situation they're in, they feel they have no life. Hmm? Even though they come home to a life, there is literally a life that they're in. Privately, there is a disenfranchisement. Hmm? Do you find that in your neighborhood? That you were saying that you saw elements of that politically and structurally in the neighborhood that you were in? Kai?
Um,
Well, we find it in conversation, or you find it in situation. If you go around, you see it's pretty weird.
That it is weird, yes.
Seemingly weird because it does seem to require uh, such a belief sometimes that you're imagining yourself doing that. And I say, I can do that in a movie. But, and I say, well, why? I say, because the establishment of that belief is a kind of introducing a level of violence into one's life that becomes normal. And I say, why? Because then it creates a kind of we and them construct. Um, and somehow the them is dehumanized. So I said, holy shit, you walk into that process, and that if you walk through it, it becomes normal. But
Yeah,
then you find yourself in your own life having friends that cross the line, and they could have just been acquaintances, accidental meetings or something, but then they become, there's a friendliness, and the friendliness comes to define the relationship more than the differences. In fact, the differences become sort of creatively integrated into, you kind of get what's happening once you have a friend of a different situation. You see things that opens up your creative perspective to some degree. So friendship allows a feeling, allows a connection that even if it loses that connection, it feels betrayed and an action happened, or it has a very powerful thing. It can be a reference in time, friendship. But then you see all the acts that come with friendship, where there is an intimacy and there is a shared intimacy. The loss of that shared intimacy through some action or whatever uh, can send one into a whole other world of spite and hurt and this and that, where the everyday, even just washing your dishes or cooking something, is spite running through the story in some way.
yeah, yes.
And then you may see just walking that normal situation um, has so many intrigues in its history, and yet, uh, so you're in it but not of it. But as you walk through it, you see things that are nuanced that we were discussing last week, that there can be a hurt for 30 years, and then it would take one, a feeling, a dream, a hurt that cracks the situation where there's even a passing away, generally, that all of a sudden creates a hey baby moment that releases the story from its literalness.
Yeah,
And it sees the play that you were in. And it sees the forces that were running through it. And somehow you knew that those forces were running through it while you were in it, but you didn't literally know the forces that were running through it were the similar forces that were running through the body, that were running through time and space, that were running through everything. And the situation that you were in was subject to these underlying forces. And so as you become aware of that, your life almost becomes it's a creative expression, where you assumed identities, but you were not at home in the world of identity that way, where it literalized. But that somehow you were able to assume the identity, and that there was a deeper relationship to the art of it than it was to the literal contract of it. Because the contract of it will make everyone sneaks and figuring out how to get out of this or that. You understand? But in fact, the seeing of the passage of it sees the situation almost like the seasons. Now, I'm not saying that be cool, calm, and collected, because every now and then there will be a quick kick in the cooler about something in retrospect that is very lame, but
Right.
is meaningful and somehow is meaningful in the moment. And it is a kind of the guy who described the war, he said, what the hell are we fighting about? When he saw that 3 million were killed here and this happened and that, he said, what was it all about anyway? They said they had to have a war to have a conversation.
Mm.
Hmm? So, if you'd like, maybe you can contact this fellow and expand it a bit, and then invite him into even coming on.
Okay.
Or if he'd, we'll see.
Maybe I'll have a conversation with him first and
Look, there is, as I said, during the week or so, there have been 4 or 5 friends that we know actively who then are seemingly visiting, passing away in
yeah,
the circumstance that they're in. But
yes.
they're also in another circumstance of relationship being up in the air, and a simultaneity where the body is almost a relationship, sort of like a love affair oneself. And that's what I was mentioning to Marty today, that you then see that you've never said, hey, baby, to the body.
Mm.
You thought you knew it, you were getting treatment and you were doing this or that, but that somehow the body that you're in has been going through this juggling act of existence. And whether its juggling act is the same around the lying, dying, or living, I felt that there was almost a falling in love with the body in a weird way. Isn't it weird? Almost like a relationship
I've been working on that.
where you considered its feelings,
Mm-hmm.
and somehow it was revealing itself. Then I read something about dogs somehow knowing what you're thinking and what you're doing, and they know if you're lying or telling the truth or whatever.
Mm.
And so they say, okay, if the dog knows that, then my foot must know. My foot is that I must know that I'm just trying to get it to shut up and leave me alone or something like that. Just like your kid would know if you wanted to sneak out or something like that, and you say, and so you tell them something and they know that you're making up a story.
Totally.
So let's say your body also knows when you're making up a story. It has the same tenderness or the same kind of truthfulness. That is not literally a truthfulness, but there is a feeling that allows them then to go to sleep. But somehow, if they know that you're tricking them, they'll be ball busters.
Mm.
That's supposedly, this is the spiritual premise of existence. That somehow there are events that are causing a kind of truth that it's not a taught truth. It's a discovery form of truth. That there is a parallel world with you that was trying to be manifest by religion, saying that there is something observing you and this is happening, and so therefore you will be guilty if you violate it, and guilt is having a conversation with the mystery. And the cumulative, because then it seems that the need to survive has guilt trailing alongside it because it's personalized. But then let's say that you then, as most of us have some element of discovery in our life that is not owned by identity in our history, but somehow coming from a different place. We enter into the story from a different place. That there are somehow moments of experience. Now, some cases, war was one of them, people coming back from war, or having an experience re-entering into a normalized life. after they saw the underpinnings, what happens in the brutality or whatever, then supposedly suffered a consequence psychologically that had to be retrained or recreated. But in fact, they did see something on the other side that's hidden in plain sight. Whenever one is exposed to what is normally hidden,
Yeah.
there is a discovery that changes the picture somewhat when you re-enter the story. Um, when you've created a life that comes more out of discovery or feeling, then you've also created people who are interacting with you that are also then coming out of discovery. It freed the story somewhat from its literalness. But it, whoosh. So shall we call this fellow? You'll call him sometime today or something?
Yeah, I'll at least write him an email today. Yeah.
Just as a way of trying to ascertain where we don't want it to be too heavy,
Mhm.
where he then stumbles into a situation where we have created a premise to some degree. And even Urja is a death doula. Now, when you look up the doulas, the doula used to mean something like a midwife. But then they've expanded doula now to mean people who have normalized dying and living. So they're not exactly hospice care or hospice or anything like that. They're friends who've gotten together, some of them, and then they are available as friends to almost explore the different dimensions. So even though some of them may be aware of what you get from Social Security, and that's not their situation. Their situation is what is happening for them. They see is also happening for others, but they only become aware of it when there's some critical mass or some crisis happening. But what the crisis forces them to become aware of something that's been happening all along. And so that's why I mean meeting the body, where you see, when you see the critical mass, you see that the body has somehow been dealing with this, that it's been a creative life for the body. It's been juggling and doing this and up and down, you see. And as you then become aware of it, you become aware of a grace that somehow has run through the life that you've lived. Uh, so then you start to see that dying and living affected the story. When you see that, you see how it affected the thought process under certain situations. That somehow one was essentially aware of that creative element in the life. And that somehow you were able to go from being, we'll say, broke, and then all of a sudden stepping into a situation where it was more of a shared life. And so it wasn't literally a job, it's essentially, but somehow feelings open up doorways of expression.
Mm.
And when you see that the feelings open up doorways of expression, you see that it's limited in time, that somehow it's like a puff of smoke in some way. It will evaporate into the atmosphere
Mhm.
to some extent. There was an experience that one had creatively. And you see in the creative life, that is what one is, once one becomes absorbed creatively, or their life as a creative medium, they start to then explore the world, or even the everydayness. The creative perspective enters into the story. And that means a non-ownership, that there's an interest in the life that naturalizes conversations between different dimensions, where there is no uh, separation. Let's say some accident introduces you to a parallel life that you lived alongside your life. And that was how one survived, but had suppressed different elements in the situation that when it's revealed, you say, holy shit, did I go through that? Was that what was happening?
Yeah.
So you see a whole other dimension or dimensions of one's version of life, and also seen from the perspective of flying overhead, seeing all the differences in each individual's life as they collectively did something. So let's say you have somehow a creative perspective on a happening, that time is only an aspect of it. So that's what happens in retrospect when one is utilizing elements of their own life to write something or to create something. And you see it is resembling some of the things that you've gone through. But it's not literally that way. It's seen from the creative eye. So from the creative eye, it sets a stage. And once it has that kind of stage, then it's seeing it from different perspectives at the same time. So what is missing from the interaction is the larger picture that looks like tomorrow or yesterday, the larger picture over it.
Yeah.
Peering into it, one sees time and space as a different thing that's going on. So let's say if one peers into the stage here, the naturalization of the dogs wanting to go out, Eric visiting tomorrow with his friend coming in, the shift from the yurt to a room there, and he's made it into a very cool styled room. With screens in it, and we're kidding around about that. But also, all of a sudden, being where you are, looking out for it or caring for it, just essentially by essentially seeing it to be a creative act. So, who will leave next week? How will that shift? Who will be visiting? Who just got an operation? Is anyone passing away? Are they close to it? Because you see in many of the passings away or coming close to it has brought a remarkable togetherness in some cases that were kind of fractured before that. And so you say that how weird it is, Derek. He couldn't say that John couldn't have orchestrated a better coming together.
Yeah.
Than we found in the bathtub. Or Marty couldn't have invented a better way to all of a sudden pop into the situation as if he lives next door or something like that, okay. And they say, all you need is bladder cancer, and you can take away time and space and have some empathy. And in the empathy, it washes away some elements of the literal story. Especially when there's nothing to do, literally, except your presence. But we are being visited in some way or another. That dying doesn't only mean dying of the body, that's one aspect of it, but dying of the story also. And so you see that everything that is a thing is dying, or living, or dying, or living. And if you look at some of these Olympics or something like that, and you see these youngsters, they're pretty remarkable. So you see a whole other world that's going on without you, if it is going on. But supposedly, I don't know if the medium out there is a reference of what's happening out in the world. Or in fact, just talking to people or seeing this or accidentally. But you also see a world that somehow one is increasingly irrelevant in. That its interests aren't so interesting in some way in the direction that it's going. And that there's more of a what do you say, Kai? you've left yourself somewhat computer free? Or are you in,
Everything I do depends on my computer.
yeah, but I mean, are you hip to all the other aspects of it?
Mm, I'm hip to what I need to know to do what I need to do. That's
So
it.
everyone is that. So everyone else is limited though by their interest.
Yes, absolutely.
Uh, and what about you, Derek? Are you really hip in the computer world?
I guess I can navigate through some deeper elements, but there's always way much further to go, in terms of nuance that would require real learning, real time and effort to.
So it's your interests have limited your knowing the whole medium, because
Yes.
sometimes it takes you a year to find out that it was a button away.
Totally.
Exactly.
That's what I mean. Like if everybody took a course.
Whatever level you're on, there's also another medium that's going on. And it's pretty interesting. Yeah. No, so then you find yourself subject to your limitations. Is it hard to learn something?
No. For me, no. I like to learn stuff. So.
Oh, you do.
Yeah.
And what about you, Kai? If they say if you open this up, then and they say no, thanks.
I always hesitate because I'm like, I don't want to have to learn that. Once I learn it, I'm fine.
Yeah.
But it's the initial, you're going to have to learn all of this to do that. Now, Tigo, he likes computers in and of themselves. So he just learns it because he likes it.
Yeah. So
Just
then,
it.
and I think that Seth likes games,
Mhm.
but then it becomes a deep world of games where games and reality are intermingling or whatever.
Mm.
And in fact, they could put on screen a whole political process that they think is happening, and have
Yep.
them acting out, and even put their faces on them.
Yeah.
So let's say that once you step into it, it's hidden in plain sight. But let's say we walk past it, and then what looks like game playing is some complex conspiracy theories that are underlying the games, because everything is kind of revealed in the games, just like it is in a movie, what the real motives are, what really happened, not just what you read in the newspapers or saw on CNN, but you were in the room when they were making the deal. Okay. So let's say then once you start doing this, you are in a conspiratorial world where you see that people were talking in back rooms or making deals or whatever. And then And then you see that even about war, that they were making deals out there and talking shit. And then all of a sudden they send 50,000 kids to get killed or something like that.
Yeah.
And then they discover later on it wasn't around this rah, rah, rah stuff. It was around some other scenes that were going on or whatever. Okay. So you see, and so then you kind of see the disillusionment that happens with the story and the literal reality when you run into it.
Yeah.
Okay. But your relationship somehow was more to the magical aspects of it, to the story. So let's say when the logic of the premise is that you become indoctrinated through a certain way of being, so that you'll have a certain way of thinking. But let's say that somehow one explores all different forms and sees that there's many ways of thinking and exploring and living and whatever. That it's a multidimensional. But let's say the social framework that you come from says that there's one way, and that is continuity, and there's a literal identity that seeks to continue. And but then some accident happens or whatever, where you then see the world from a different place. And then they start to say, well, hold it, you see over millions, over thousands of years, you see intermarriage happening. You see people, earthquakes happening, and then people marrying and having babies and this and that, and different religions. They just adopted religions to survive or whatever in a circumstance. But you see this whole process happening.
Mm.
Hmm? And they're still trying to organize what is going on. What is it to be a human being? What is it to have an experience?
That's it.
You say, and the Persia says it's a pain in the neck. That's what it is. Well, sometimes to be a human being is to be a pain in the neck. Sometimes to be a human being is to be delighted or thrilled or hurt or wounded, or but somehow a whole range of experiences is inside a human life. That it stays in any one of them, I think that it is a whole. Once life is experienced to some degree as a creative act, that is the second nature of seeing that living and dying are intertwined like breathing are, is. And that all natural things, and so relationship is an I and thou element. When it comes together, a process happens. And when in fact that process is not happening, then it finds ways to, so it finds ways to come together, and it finds ways to, so it uses reasons for it, but it's not really the reasons for it. There's a process that's happening. So when the relationships are so close, they experience this process that's happening. And there is a process of coming together around energies. And there is a process of literally parting, where to some degree, the experience is more a memory. That you had the experience so that you can have the memory of it in some way. That there's more, and the depth of relationship is somehow not in absence, but there is something in absence that brings on another presence. Or it reveals another dimension of the situation. The absence kind of reveals an experience hidden in the circumstance that is there, and it more resembles a shadow than it does a literal experience. What do you say, Raja? Are we going too far afield with this?
No, I was just thinking of my son when you said that.
Well, I'm sure he'll fly past
He
and
does.
he'll wave at you, maybe even do bafangu, or maybe a wave or a finger or a kiss. All of those were in the experience, weren't they? But one day it would be bafangu. The next day maybe, hey mommy, how you doing? The next day, okay. So you see this whole movie. And you can even visit before him in the beginnings of him. And so if you see too much, it seems to almost resemble entirely a movie, where this comes out of that and that comes out of this, and there's this, of course, and then the very thing that people were trying to relate to you, then you try to relate to your own kids. And you see how they created a similar impossibility that you did, meaning that no one could tell them anything. But then that's what they said about Urja. No one can tell her what to do. They say, then she's got 2 kids that no one can tell them what to do. Okay. Even in the smallest thing. So, didn't you want it that way? No?
When you asked that question, I feel that I was so unconscious that.
Let's say you had to be unconscious to do what you did.
Right, exactly.
So it wasn't unconscious. So let's say we made the movie of you. And we're there with the cameras in the situation. I say, you want to run away and join Rajneesh in Oregon? And you say, hey, I'm a married woman with 2 kids. And I say, come on, let's go run away to Oregon. And they say, holy shit, did I do that? Did I run away? Did I run away? And even that, what they're talking about on Netflix, that movie about Rajneesh there, did I actually do that? Did I go from fairly straight person in New York with a family to all of a sudden I'm doing hi, namaste, while a car is going past and this and I'm doing yoga lessons and this one and boyfriends and girl. All of a sudden I'm a person. I'm a person who happens to be a married woman with children. But happens to be. What I am now is someone who's dancing in Oregon to Sanskrit music. And that's how they know me. As a good dancer or someone who's a funny person, they don't know me as this other person so much. They think that's really me. But if any of those not me's come to visit me, it's going to be very awkward. Everyone dancing around and jumping around and doing their thing, and the guy come down and say, are you kidding me? Okay, so somehow, how are you going to integrate that into this jumping around thing? So you understand, you want to take on this movie? Somehow you integrated where it was still somehow family, there was still feeling that connected it, but it literally didn't have a form anymore that it had, where you had a home to live in and you this and that happened. Then it was completely a different form. They couldn't do completely Rajneesh because it seemed silly. And it seemed like old people jumping around. Okay. But they did their own version of you. You want the job, Ursha?
Well, the job is already done.
The job is taken. Well, let's say in retrospect, where it's not a possessive, you're introduced to a life that you've lived.
Yes.
But you were only part of it. Now you see it from the perspective. You could even be dopey enough to see it, how the lungs saw it, why you were living your life, how were your lungs doing? Did you say lungs, you want to continue smoking? So somehow, just like if you knew you were cheating on someone, you knew that you were cheating on your body, on your lungs, you're saying it's okay, it's this and that, and you understand. So even though it has signs that says, hey, hey, take care of me for a minute, somehow you're able to do this or figure this out, or as a normal situation. You see, the normalcy of one's life is somehow there is not a separation, it's built into the system somehow, that there's a whole you that is operating, that is not considered by you to be you. It's your nose, it's your livers, it's your kidneys, it's whatever, it's your heart, it's your brain. But somehow you're able to identify when you say something comes from the heart. Yeah, you may put your hand on the heart, but it's a heartfelt means something different. So somehow there are certain sentiments or expressions that are related to different organs, that the different organs of your body are experienced with it.
Yes.
But to become aware is not to become overburdened with it. It's to see second nature to you now, what has been happening all along. That a kind of creative life has been coexisting with the literal life all along. And so what the mind has literalized as an existence has in fact found itself in this creative experience where somehow in relationship there are signals that are exchanged that normalize hanging out together, normalize this, or feel there's a certain feeling that even in its absence, it kind of is a protective. So when one is moving naturally in such a thing, it literalizes what that is. But it is subject to it when something takes place. You're subject to an experience yourself. If this one is going through that or that one is going through this, you have something of what it must be like in your own experience. So you see that somehow friendship has enlarged the capacity to experience where it doesn't always have to be literal. It may be happening to someone that you have feelings for. And in that, there are times you may even have more of an experience than the person who's literally having the experience. So let's say that when we are talking with friends who are literally in that space, that cancer is happening or this is happening, so somehow you then have to talk to people whose premise is treatment and this and that, and you understand it, and yet you're juggling your life. And so therefore you're juggling this sense of how far involved in treatment will you get. And now that premise is that you have space between yourself and the experience. Then you may be in the experience and only where it's an inch away, where you say, holy shit, go ahead, yes, do anything you want. Please help me, save me. You're free to do that. You're free to say, please help me, I'm scared. You want to try it for a moment? You want to rehearse that, Erja? If these guys come and knocking on the door and they open the door and say, can you, let me see. You want to scream a little bit? You don't want to do that one?
Scream
Or cry, or spit, or get angry. Or get angry. You can also act like,
the
what the hell
physical.
took you so long? What the hell took you so long? Don't you know I'm a dying woman? You can get your right. You don't want to rehearse any of these roles. You don't want to be mellow. What a dumb day we're spending here together. Can one stylize their experience? So you see, you do want to do mellow, don't you? Do you want to do wise and mellow, Erja?
Yes.
Want to say something cool and say, verily I say unto you, if a man has two sheep, where did I get that one from? What would you say? Voulez-vous? C'est la vie?
I like your style, Danny. You tell jokes.
Tell jokes, yeah. Although you could say, excuse me, but I like another year to see how the garden turns out. I'm exploring this whole dumb concept of even saying for a moment with Marty and the others, whatever the situation they're in, can we kind of creatively agree to a year that you'll figure out what you have to do, take what you have to take or don't take, but creatively come home to that you have a year to play with. And that you kind of recognize that you can negotiate with dying and living in a different way. That time is one factor in the body, but I do feel if there's a creative act that takes place, the time shifts. And so I did feel that if two lovers look at the cancer treatment as their experience, so that was what I was suggesting to Marty. I said, if you had the lover to go into you, then let the lovers discuss what kind of treatment they want, consistent with their love affair, and say they're buying a 3-year love affair, that they're taking the treatment necessary. to have a 3-year love affair, which probably means instead of getting chemo, you fly out to Bali instead of getting chemo, and you'll try to make love as much as possible or something, and walk around like that. And okay, so let's say you're buying 3 years. How can you buy 3 years if you have these tubes all over your nose and up your behind and this and that? So you say, well, it'll be hard. They'll be very cranky 3 years. So is it too dumb to think from the love affair into the story, where it's not a threat or whatever, but it's kind of based on how deeply the love is felt? It's not that you're getting a caretaker. It's that there is an I and thou experience taking place. I feel that an I and thou experience is its own health. And that there can be these dumbness of the idea that there can be a conversation with one's own body or with the energy, where I think then you will see the beginnings of prayer wasn't for something. It was a conversation. The conversation illuminated. The doer was part of that. It was not the owner of the experience. So somehow what looks like confusion in what to do is because the doer, even though we're being forced into doing, the doer is not that prominent in the larger picture. The doer is usually what got you in jams or in troubles or in difficult situations. Okay, so now we'll say creatively it's not bad or good, because the jams that the doer got you into allowed you to have life experiences of how to navigate through the story, how to navigate through one's existence. But it wasn't rules or orders. It was that way. It was more of a creative life. And so when one is living it, one kind of has their own integrity that runs alongside it. So your kind of relationship is through that thread. And so the friends that you make in relationship to that have a relationship to that thread that runs through the story, that somehow is free. And yet somehow it's different if people who are normally free commit. But it's not the commitment of a landlord that has a motive. It's not the commitment of the literalness of the job where you have to sign a contract because they want to ensure continuity. But when the feeling creates a continuity and it literalizes, it also starts to fall apart as it's literal. Because it was never literal, it was always an exploration, an interaction, a feeling, allow the closeness, a shape to take place. So we live then in a few worlds. You see that there are worlds that are organized, that have organized behavior, that is literalizes a situation. But then you also see that relationship itself is a creative act that's inherently free. And so when it has to suppress itself to maintain continuity, then events are waiting in the situation that are hidden in plain sight. But one can see an energy running through the literal story. So one can see an event waiting in time. And so you see the approximation of living and dying is happening in different levels. From something rusting out, something getting old and broken or something like that, where you see that in fact, only because you recognize it do you see a process has happened. But then someone who's devoted themselves, will say, to carpentry or this or that, have a process of extending the dying and living process. Functionally or whatever. So you see all of this is happening. And you also see that it's happening in medicine and it's happening in many other forms, supposedly. And so then it's also a premise that enters into a social fabric of living longer if you do this, if you do that, living better if you do this or you do that, or and so, and better usually has you smiling and happy about something. So I don't think being pissed off is better. Like I'm taking vitamin D so I can be pissed off. You wouldn't do that. So you would take the vitamin D so I can be happy or nicer and this and that. So they say, well, hold it, I'm stepping into weird stories here. Hmm? Are you okay, Urja? So you've lived a life
Yes.
and you get to visit the life that you've lived from a different perspective, where you're not the owner. You start to see other dimensions of the everyday experience
More and more. Yeah.
that was happening. And then you can see something that happened earlier that manifested 15 years later.
Mhm.
You can see an argument that may have happened 20 years earlier that then manifested philosophically. So then one gets to visit from a certain perspective in their life or situation in their life. They get to visit the life that they've lived, not as their life so much, but as a kind of seeing it that releases the story that only the released story can see, the other dimension hidden in. And then it was to see the story as dying saw it, as the dying element stole your life.
Mm,
You
yes.
see that there was the relationship to poetry was inherently a relationship to poetry that was happening in your life while you were living it. And that sometimes you would be able to creatively contact an element that was happening in your life. But you see the life then from the dying element and the living element, the cooperation that took place, what was taking place, and you see to some degree the physical elements that you went through.
Yeah.
But you also start to contact elements in yourself, in my experience, that you see were secretly in the story in a way that affected what you did, even as a naive kid. That somehow there were certain elements or hidden elements in your life. And we'll say, for instance, I remember that we were little kids, and this big kid got us in trouble. And then they were telling us what was the name of the big kid, and we wouldn't tell them the name of we were just as little kids, we wouldn't tell them no matter. They put us in the youth house, what they call the youth house, reform school, and we were held there because we wouldn't tell them the name of the big kid that got us
Wow.
in trouble, and it was such a real thing too. You understand, no matter what they were doing or saying or the punishment or whatever, you couldn't be a rat. Hmm? And everyone would talk you out of it, but somehow, even if a psychiatrist came to you or something like that, you couldn't be a rat about something that was so obvious.
Yeah.
Okay. What is that? What is that urge? What is the sticking it out with someone, even though they may say, no, don't do this, this is crazy. Don't be with this person. Why can't you just talk someone easily out of a domestic problem situation? And they say, no, but I love him. Do you understand what that means? And they say, yeah, but he gave you a black eye, man. And you say, but I love him. And you say, come on, snap out of it. You think you would be convincing? Didn't you once have a situation once where I was saying to you, but you got a black eye? And you said, but I love him. Didn't that
No,
never,
my
that never,
mother, guys.
that must have happened to me, I think. I think I had the black eye. There was one time where we were being separated and we were crying to be together. And I say, are you kidding? Are you guys crazy? Okay. Does that sound familiar, Kai? Where
Well,
someone,
I've
yeah,
had black eyes.
and let's say we were in a situation where we got in trouble, and then they were saying, why don't you guys break up? Are you guys crazy? You don't really fit together. And then she started crying. I was crying. Yeah, you're getting a lesson from this, Carrie?
Mm,
And
mm.
the lawyer and the mother-in-law was saying, but maybe you can just take a break or something like that. And of course, that was the most intelligent advice that they were giving. But of course, we were committed to an experience waiting in the story. Hmm?
But Danny, the beauty of that is then 25 years later, I get to have this beautiful kind
That was the beginning of Michelle, who passed away.
of,
That these two misfits were crying because we were being broken up. And so that made it more determined. And I realized determined to have Michelle. In other words, there was something in the story, because if you logically looked at it and say, what the hell are you guys, they were right. Why didn't we just take a break from the situation? Okay. And you see that somehow there was a baby in the picture. And you see that somehow you are navigating around, that there is somehow a baby in the picture that's not literally there, but, and that
some beauty. There's a,
somehow the connected relationship for a period of time is giving a kind of promise towards that end, realizing, so that it's not just ending or breaking up or shifting, which is a natural form, but it is also on another level where like my immune system yelled at me for getting the vaccination. It says, you dirty, sneaky rat bastard, or whatever. Then you also see that somehow you were in a relationship, that there was a baby promise, and you hear the baby saying, you rat bastard, you left me, you were supposed to be doing that, the shit you were talking. And you say, holy shit, how many cells do I have? How many situations exist? What kind of memories of me? Who is me? Where is me? Is there a me? But then I also navigated that somehow having the baby is a real deep thing for me. It has to be a conscious act. Coming out of a feeling, it can't be that I'm biologically organized into this or that or something. Somehow it has to be, hey, baby, let's do this thing. Not that somehow I was walking down the street and a rope grabbed me by the neck and there was a mother-in-law and a daughter. Matter of fact, they need the baby somehow, which is what I stepped in, where somehow they needed a boy who had a touch of Jew in him, not was Jewish, but somehow had a Jewish mother who slept with a Catholic, but they needed that mixture. And then I say, this shit must be going on for thousands of years around survival in families, and boys meet girls and situations like that, and happen. Probably all history is as dumb as that. And which I can't say is dumb as much as is free from logic. So if you track the whole attraction and the whole experience, you see that you were just a medium for something to happen. But someone ran up on you. Is that Kerry? That's going to be your defense in court? I don't know. They just ran up on me. I didn't know what the hell he wanted. I didn't say anything. I didn't do anything. They just ran up on me and incorporated me into some kind of weird experience. Would you be able to say something like that? That somehow you were innocent bystander and that life somehow incorporated you into this experience of being carried. Accidents.
Hmm.
Or do you see much planning in carry? You see before that you were born, they were planning and say, okay, we'll make sure that he'll be type O, positive, and that maybe he'll have a career in art and science. And so you don't think much planning happened. Okay. So then,
So
do you see any planning happening at all?
maybe in the energetic level, but
Okay.
not by the ego so much, I guess.
Well, if they didn't have a plan for you beforehand, then you probably, those of us who weren't planned beforehand, but were more written into the story, then the basic structural education doesn't become that important as to the creative one.
Yeah.
Hmm? So you
Right.
see, even in the courses in college, it'll be more philosophical because there is a "who am I" question running creatively, where the identity is not exactly enough, a historical identity.
Yeah.
So then you see that again, it's like a movie. When you have that perception, you see it very much like a director would see it or a screenwriter would see it. You start to see the threads that run through the story. So it would be like a Scorsese writing the life of, doing the film of Jesus, but then Jesus as friends hanging out, Jesus as people living a life,
Hmm.
but then subject to forces around them and situations, so that when these forces then hit them, the peoplehood of who they were, then you start to see it almost has elements of show business, where regular straight people are then all of a sudden celebrated in such a way where they still retain being people, but they have to hide that.
Hmm.
That becomes part of showmanship. So you start to see the dichotomy where even the kid who was doing the Olympics there said that she forgot the twist or something, but there was a fracture with the body memory and the self, okay, where it literalizes. So let's say that you walk into a situation and all of a sudden you're hired as an actor, and then you're the boyfriend and you're this, and then you're the bastard. And they say,
Yeah.
why do I have to be a bastard? They say, if you're going to do boyfriend, you're going to have to do bastard also. Why? And I said, because it's kind of written into the script. You're going to choose something or do something or hide something. So when it's discovered, they say, you bastard, you would do it. So they say, do you want the job? And I say, let me have the experience first, and then I'll take up the. And I say, the experience is not hard to get. All you have to do is be natural.
Right.
And there will be a situation. And I said, why? Because it appears to be written into the script.
Hmm.
That somehow a shifting of the feeling. And the shifting of the feeling may be any of those things. The shifting of the feeling may be that your move was to get out of having a baby.
Hmm.
The unsaid, the unaddressed, the fearful, because that would have demanded a continuity or, okay.
Right.
So then you say, holy shit, how many stories are happening simultaneously that our consciousness has the consciousness is there enough to avoid it, but not enough there to see it.
But there's some subconscious kind of awareness of it.
That basically there is kind of decisions that are being made that are not around the people, or around maybe their blood, maybe around their blood types, maybe around who they are, maybe are these the right people for each other for a baby. So then if in fact there is some instinctive knowledge where you see that these are the wrong people to have a baby, you'll start to see arguments happening.
Mm.
So we then become aware that there is a body, not as an instrument that smells, that feels, that shares, that. So then you see that it is not only a flaw in what you're in, but that somehow there is there is an inherent, like Shiva and Shakti said, there is an inherent virginity or celibacy that is not sexual, but is sensual. And somehow sensual is around the true thing.
Yeah.
Sexual is around more of loneliness and the historical pressure.
Right.
So the two things are there in you. When somehow
Yeah.
it needs to have something of a true love, and that's not laid out. And at the same time, your people with experiences or whatever, you usually have a duality.
Mm-hmm.
So you try to have the vows say, no, you will do this and you will do that according to the vows. Because you see that the vow did represent something that was true. But it can't be something that's ordered or forced or a gun to your head. It has to come from a heartfelt in some way.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah.
And when it comes from rules, then it creates a dual person that is living a secret life, then has a secret situation going.
Yeah.
So let's say that let's say your screw up was not exactly a screw up, but a brilliant way of ducking a question that is almost impossible to have a simple conversation about. But let's say that the fundamental underpinnings are that somehow your presence promised a baby. And in fact, not only that, but Mother Jumper, you owe me a baby. And don't give me this bullshit about show business.
I've heard that before, actually.
Okay. So let's say you didn't know that Mother Jumper, but you did kind of know that because you kind of know that somehow you've been ducking it or avoiding it or somehow the situation. And I say, well, okay, that it's happening anyway, but one is subject to forces. Where confusion in the relationship is normal because it's what's happening. It is confused.
Yeah.
You know, and it can't be forced out of a gun to your head or forced on it somehow. So, so let's say the relationship is there in some way, but the story is not laid out. Because we'll say then for you, the story has to come from a clear space.
Yeah.
Good luck. You should, you probably will. John falling out there in the bathtub freed the story remarkably, didn't it?
Yes.
To just basic concern, if he's okay.
Yeah.
The other elements of that, or you see the family will take up the literal story. But the one thing that it took was it just brought out the friendship as being the medium.
Yeah.
The literal story may come back in time, but you see that it was more an evocative. Somehow when dying is almost revealed, but not only dying, but you see a secret life where dying was in the everyday. And we've been exploring now for the last year this dying, living sentiment of seeing it simultaneously. So you see the situations that you were in were dying while you were living with them. and that there was always a nuance about leaving or this happening or that happening anyway. So there was always evidence of dying being in the picture. And it's not that you're more clever in recognizing it, because recognition is usually withheld until it's too late. It's somehow that people are driven towards the experience. So it's not as if they couldn't have had a hey baby, we're not meant for this or that, or I don't know. But that somehow it had to be discovered, hidden in plain sight. So it took a death of someone dear to have a phone call of someone who didn't speak to you for 30 or 40 years over this issue or that happening, or we can't remember. But all of a sudden, the passing away has a hey baby phone call. And you see something that looked like years ago has been parallel with you all along. But it wasn't up to the doer. The doer could not enter into the story and say, as if it was a business deal or something like that. Something had to shift the situation where the story was not the prominent thing, but a feeling connected you. So somehow the feeling was rediscovered, and you saw that you shared some part of your life around the feeling. And that it then starts to shift to memory. This is challenging, because as you start to experience a life that is no longer based on a continuum, where the parents are released from the story as being screw-ups, fuck-ups, brilliant, whatever they were, but they didn't leave you kind of a history. You're not exactly this, and you're not exactly that, and you're not exactly this. But you've kind of entered into the life free form, where you assume the identities of the relationships, where the life itself is a creative act. And then it has the elements of it can tap dance, or it can do clown work, or it can do this, or it can do push-ups, but basically it assumes identity as one of its organizing way of surviving or expressing.
Right.
To perceive that is to see that somehow there's an energy before there's an identity. And that's the basis of friendship, is that somehow, even in 5 minutes, you meet an energy in a person accidentally.
Mm-hmm.
Even their own family may not be able to meet, literally, but you meet in the moment. So as you meet that person from time to time, you meet in that space. And that space is usually not included in their literal life. So it becomes psychological, and it becomes this or that. But in fact, in that zone where people are meeting, it is normal. What is their normal life is theater. Their real life supposedly is this inner perspective in relationship to the normal life. So when the people experience a creative aspect in their life, they start to see a creative dimension in the world that they're in. So there is something in a creative dimension that needs to be true, as if you were watching it on screen, and you would be able to detect if it was false or not, because you're coming from a certain feeling in the screen. So you would see where it's a clunker. When that creative dimension enters into your life, then seeing when something is full of shit becomes normal. Just as if you were seeing it on screen. You can see it if the emotions, you can see if you're moved by the emotions or something in the screen, or you can see if it's bullshit or it's a trick or whatever, the underpinnings that run through it. So somehow the creative eye now comes into your everyday life. So then you see the issues that happens between lovers are issues that are based on a frequency of feeling. that then wrap themselves around certain issues, but that there is a kind of flux in the interaction. There is a dynamic taking place creatively when another one comes into your life, another being comes into your life and is shared intimately. You're experiencing elements of what is called I and thou, or a weaving of feelings into even in memory. So then somehow there's an instinctive sense when that unfolds or that shifts or that's changing.
Yeah.
Okay. So then, and I say why? Because the relationship then became a continuum where the continuum becomes the strength, the strongest force. And then the premise, the fear is that you're disrupting a lifestyle or a situation. And it's true. It does take what was normalized into an up in the airness about it.
Mm-hmm.
Because then you see that there is something of a commitment to stability or form or circumstance. So let's say that the discovery of different dimensions of life doesn't leave the doer. The doer then doesn't seem to be so predominant
Mm-hmm.
in the seeing, because you see how many dimensions are there. But you also see how deeply it's missing an honest conversation. And you see that the honest conversation is not an attitudinal conversation, is not anything laid on it. It's past the ego. So it looks like confession, which has hints of it. And what they had in the Catholic confessional is that somehow you had to go through communion and confirmation and go through all this ritual so that you had a confession purely that was honest so that you can receive Jesus. So what were they saying? The body of Jesus through this wafer the next morning. So there was something remarkable in that story that somehow you can confess, but first you had to have the right to confess. And then in the confession, then you were to do a penance of some sort. And in doing the penance, you can then receive the body and blood of Jesus in the ceremony on Sunday morning. So let's say, what were they describing there? That somehow if you admit your guilt or you to something, to that voice, to the energy. So in some sense, they were stylizing how you should live and how to be. You see that they were not explaining to the children, look what was happening in your body, and you're subject to what's happening in your body. And everyone around you knows what's happening in your body when you're getting a period or when you're just starting to become a boy or a man at 13 years old. Also, there's a similarity in the bodies. So those around you know what you're kind of confused about. And that somehow your body is then being able, and so they're teaching you rules and regulations, but you still don't fully get it. So it's in the hands of others that are telling you the rules and what to do and what you should be ashamed of and not be ashamed of, or how you should work it out. But here you are, a kid happening to your body. And there's nothing that says, look, this is happening to your body. And so you may start getting dreams and hopes and schemes and so on like that that's happening to you. But somehow understand there's a normalcy in what's happening to your body because your body is also becoming able to have a child. So as your body becomes able to have a child, you'll start having thoughts of wanting to, you'll have thoughts then of finding boyfriends and girlfriends and getting married and having families. And so this is kind of written, and everyone, those around you, your family knows all this. And so they're watching you and governing you. And they say, why? Because there's something in you that will sneak away. And they say, why? Because somehow the having the baby and having or making the love is personal, it's quiet or secret, not part of the family sharing or something like that, whatever. And so you don't even know that it's normal. But you are made to then be a sneak and a this and a that because there is something somehow that you're intuiting that's sacred in the act, that's special. And its specialness is lost if it's possessed by the other, if others are owning it and instructing you in it. So somehow the body supposedly being prepared to have a child, unbeknownst to the person around 13-ish, the boys are also going through this process, not in the apparent way, but in a way that is deeply confusing. Now, I don't know that it needs only a psychological sit down, but it is a what the holy shit period to be subject to these forces and be normal at the same time in the world. But then you become aware that those who are in charge of you are watching you because you are subject to certain forces, supposedly, while you're growing up, that they have to watch out for that you don't get. So you discover other dimensions, that much of your experiences were karmic, were kind of written already in the body. And we're waiting for an accident to happen. But the accident would also come out of the situation you were in. And that was that the situation was preparing also for the capacity to have children. The bodies of the people, the youngsters, were preparing for that without them fully knowing that. And somehow the accidents that they bumped into, or the dances that they went to, or the circumstances that they were involved in, were all organized somewhat by the body and the circumstance. And somehow they had structures that was telling them what grade they could be in, what level of knowledge they had. But somehow you were to find out about your life in increments over time. While those who were caring for your life saw this other picture that you were informed about only much later. But then if you become aware of a whole system and family and structure who had an interactive with you, of watching, of caring, of not caring, of hiding, then you view the structure that you were just in. And as it shifts, you see the hiding, the framework, and all of it is relatively true. Because somehow one's life is not coming with instructions. In terms of how to. That somehow there is, when there is a shared feeling, and there's a shift in the feeling, there is a going through something that even though it's tough, is experiential in a way that's very intense because it has an element of truth to it. When there is a feeling shared, somehow a corresponding reality enters into a literal story. And somehow you see the feeling then inflates the everyday story of survival. And that somehow the shifting of that feeling then introduces it as plain survival. So when there is a love affair, there's survival around something. It's a shared experience. So visiting the life is to visit dimensions, but to see it from a perspective is different than if it is karmic, where in fact it is a dominating principle. once you start to see the life as almost a coming and a going, an evolving form, an unfolding form, then something shifts with you in time and space. And I feel then that when we were talking then about seeing the living and the dying process as inherently in all forms of life, then you see the shared living and dying process when it's coming from that perception. So then when Marty was asking, and I felt if he had a love affair, then the love affair maybe decide on the treatment. But let's say we buy 3 years of our love affair with this treatment that you take. And it may be naive, and it may be magical thinking, and it may be literal medical thinking. But let's say it's coming out of the feeling. I think if it's coming out of the feeling, it adds a dimension to the story that doesn't allows the remarkableness of the medical perfection, where it means that young people grew up with a longing to learn this. And then where it's become a huge business-oriented form, where then the remarkableness of dreaming to be a doctor is then lost in once you enter into the mechanics of it all. And you lose your feeling, then you start to understand that treatment is organized into the system. And that, so then you understand that somehow you're caring for your own naturalness or your humanity, not to the extent that it becomes radicalized or becomes a trip or whatever, but you're navigating your way through different worlds. And that somehow a creative relationship or creative feeling allows you to see the perspective from a different place. So that's why sometimes I kid around with Jai or Urja and others about buying time, buying a year, or even with John the other day about can we buy a year. I think that that sentiment is also true. And I do think that this dumb thing that I'm talking about where the body has an affectionate romantic relationship with your body, where I'm sorry, baby, for neglecting you, where you see that there are similarities that allowed somehow the relationship to die or to be normalized. And as it normalized, it became literally a thing. And the thing that we're searching for in life is not a thing. In that way, it's representative of something. So for us, in one sense, the love affair is representative of a mystery, of an energy in form. And that somehow, the closer it comes for that perspective, the closer it enters into an expression where it's almost completely a creative act. You can even have a love affair to such an extent where you pretend to have an argument, just to kind of rehearse things or pretend to do this, or to pretend, but seeing it from a different perspective, because it's hard to have an argument with a straight face then. It's like arguing with Jesus Christ or something like that, and saying, how come you didn't do the dishes? You can't ask Jesus to do the dishes. And they say, why not? He may offer to do the dishes. But there's something in Jesus that's Jesus at the same time he's a regular person. There's something in the lovers that comes close to a Jesus feeling. And a Jesus feeling meaning somehow it doesn't need all the trappings or whatever. There is a feeling of trust or shared experience. And I feel that we create relationship, which is that kind of medium. And when we share it between us, it is what it is it takes a measurement of what it is to be in a literal life, in real life. So then I say, well, hold it. From the perspective of the art of life, you see the situation that you're in. And if you see the situation that you're in, you see the doer is not so important, but the seeing what is actually happening. Where you see that much of the literalness of the situation is based on avoiding the very conversation, you cannot prematurely introduce the conversation. It becomes a fight. It has to be perceived somehow. But what you do see is that the continuity is avoiding an honest conversation. But it's not that you just honestly, the honest conversation has to be an honest conversation, not something introduced. So you see inherently in a situation, there is a, depending on the level, so you enter into the story, Carrie, and we say, okay, do you want to do Carrie now? But you see creatively the circumstance from the creative perspective. The same thing that there's an attraction to Carrie that allows a doorway to open up of a shared experience. And it looks like you could have that on the side of your car. Shared experience available. Okay. But there's also something in small writing that says, wrong person sharing the experience may have a tough time and may have diarrhea, vomiting, headaches, and things like they say.
Fine print.
They say. So they say, hold it, can a person have that brand written on them that will help you in tough times, but also may give you diarrhea, coughing, in small letters? And they say, holy shit, there are some people who do cause those problems. So we'll say, Carrie come with, will be helpful under certain circumstances, under certain Buddhistic and yogic circumstance will be very helpful. But if it turns to jobs and crap and all that, it will turn to diarrhea, vomiting problems. Okay. If you read any of these labels, you can't take any of these things, right, Kai? Just reading the small labels there, how small they have it, but you say, holy crap, how can I take something like that may cause this, may cause cancer, may cause this? Okay. So let's say if we had labels, would you want the label there? Sweetheart of a guy, but watch out. That's what cancel culture is, isn't it? Okay. Or they say, no, let's have the experience of Kerry. He's a free bird. He's a free being. So as long as there's a feeling, it's a shared experience. Okay. Do you want the job? That means that you'll have relationships with people maybe Monday and Fridays.
Doesn't sound like a job.
Yeah.
Oh, no, it's relations. He's a good Monday and Friday guy. He's not a good Thursday or Tuesday guy. He's preoccupied with other things. So let's say this life as a script that you would accept has some elements in it, because let's say perceptively, one kind of has seen the life also as a creative expression. At the same time, it was a literal expression of survival and keeping it together and doing this and doing that. You see that there were threads that were underlying it that were not so much a part of the history. That there's a historical you, but there's also a kind of, when I say mystery, coming from a different time, where something can happen where you can go back 20 years and then you can go back 20 minutes. And so you see your memory is in creative time in some degree. And creative time means that it can visit its beginnings, its ends, its middles, its circumstance, its situation. And then an incident can be revealed that allows you to see an experience that you had from a different place. And so you see that that different place that you then are kind of visited a situation somehow, where you're thrown back in time and you see it from a different angle, from the life that you've lived. And you see how driven it was towards the experience that you're having now, yet it seemed crazy at the time. But you see, it was not exactly crazy. You see that you were getting out of a situation. So you start to visit a life that is not only belonging to you, but this starts to reveal a remarkably creative process in the everyday living that is being made by being normalized. So the normalization of it, where anytime you start to explore anyone's life, you start to see a whole other creative thing happening than merely the description of the person. So friendship allows you an insight into another stylized happening. That when you see that person again, you're seeing from the friendship and then the story. Where others may see the story and then the friendship. Or others may see the sun first and then the life that they're living. So they're shocked by the life that they're living when it comes, because it interferes in the literalness. So you see the literal story becomes a possessive. And so then you see the person in the possessive then has to become a sneak to do something normal. But it's not normal around the codified relationship of continuity. It's a violation. So you say everyone is built to be in love. Everyone is built to find their love. And they say, hold it, they're in a situation where they can't do that. And they say, even though they're built to do that, they're in a situation where they, okay. So then you see there's a duality that's always at work. At the same time as continuing a form, it's seeking to end the form that it's in. So then there is an incident waiting. And the incident is designed to dissolve the form that one is in. It's designed that way. Then it takes a shape, it seems. Then it takes a look. Where you see that there's a moment waiting. When the circumstance starts to become, the continuity becomes the reality, it starts to have a falseness creatively. So then there's an incident waiting that will interrupt the story. And the interruption of the story is a kind of reflection on what has been happening anyway. So when I say is that when one discovers a spiritual or creative dimension, it is discovering what is. Inherently in the story are these dimensions. They can only be experienced in retrospect in some cases because they're not owned by the ego. So you may experience a God energy in retrospect that you couldn't experience because you wanted to ask God for a favor. So somehow you reduce God to a favor. Can this lottery win, God, please? And so you kind of reduce God to some kind of favor for you, okay, in one sense, and that somehow God, the conversation with and the God energy was kind of pure, no bullshit. And that's what I think kids had in confession originally, that somehow they purely confessed, about something that was made to be evil or something like that. But you confess that Jesus had to look at it. But let's say, however much they tried to incorporate this idea, there was always in a challenging time a conversation that one had with a mystery, with an energy, with oneself, that was not had with the literal public, that was not had with the world. So when I say that you then accidentally see something that reveals a whole parallel story that you've lived. Like the discovery of mother or father as people, not being primarily parents, but as people who are doing parents. You see what everyone else saw, but you discover. Discovery creates a whole new vein. And discovery shows you that there was a parallel life. And you that with discovery, then you see the elements, discovering even the peoplehood, the personhood of your parents, is to discover a dimension that was presumed known, but discovered allows you to see more of a mystery in your life than a history. You see the accidents that happened, the situations that constituted you, but you also can get a glimpse of the circumstance, the psychic situation that was there when you were born, when you were conceived. So let's say when you visit mysterious elements that run through your life, when you discover these mysterious elements that run through your life, where they're not logical, with the threads that run through, where you can say, aha, you see that you repeated something, or you've done something through time, or you can detect a religion in your action, or you can detect a gender in your action, or you see that you come from a certain place. You meet yourself, and then you meet what gender means by, in fact, revealing in your own self where you're coming from when you look at the world. And you can see that it's laid out to some extent, you'll respond to, what you'll avoid, what you're attracted to, whatever. Those elements are there in you, and they're normalized. But once they are illuminated, then you see that the illumination shows that you were also coming from another place. That there was no literal you, there was no literal gender, there was no literal this. You see that you're composed of all of these expressions. As it is literalized, then it takes a singular shape. But as it's revealed, you understand it's the feeling that the gender is not the dominant force. The gender follows the feeling. Because it's not around, it's not captured where sexuality is around continuity. It is around sensuality. And sensuality means the truth of the feeling. Then the relationship becomes lovemaking. As it is. It doesn't need to this be, it's that, it may take this or that shape, but it's essentially coming from a true space in itself. And that true space is not so organized around continuity. It's around the truth of the experience that it's sharing. The truth of the experience that it's sharing may be long or short, but there's an experience waiting in it. And so then you kind of reveal that you entered into the story maybe to have the baby. You see there was a truth in the relationship, but it wasn't truth in its continuity. It was truth in there being a soulful enough experience to share a child. And they say, holy shit, can all this be happening in an everyday person's life? Because you don't want to make a feel-goodism of existence at the same time. But no, you see, no, it's, of course, the life is being lived on multi-dimensions. And of course, the person to be aware of these multi-dimensions, it would be stifling if they were aware of these dimensions. So these dimensions are only discovered. That there's you, the literal you, and there's you, the creative life that one is being lived. And that the creative life has some relationship to living in, to a literal dying and living. But that the creative life is utilizing dying and living more creatively by seeing everything coming and going, existing and non-existing simultaneously. That seeing living and dying as a simultaneously act. and that you also see all the elements of living and dying. You see relationship then has a discovery moment in it, where you may discover a relationship years later, where it's not owned by the literal world, but it may be a memory or a call or a feeling. Once again, that the literalness falling away may open up certain feelings that says in time has a hey baby that could never have been said while the shift is going on. But then to have a call 20 years later where hey baby is the normal conversation, not something where you start from a respect from each other, you start from a feeling shared. You realize that the person has been instrumental in your life in some way. So then you see your life almost from the creative perspective, and you see where the person fit in. And so then the question that you shared is your presence is so that the experience is a shared experience. That it's a creative experience from the get-go. Okay. And what does that mean? It's somehow that that there's a phase of the life, this phase of our life, where somehow it's coming from a true space. That's not laid out, but a bullshit space is laid out. So then that forced you into a conversation with John will say, where you had to say, hey, look, I'm not literally your nurse. I'm not literally this job with you. And we're getting caught up in the Social Security thing. You understand? Okay. So then they say, I find myself in relationship to you in the weirdest scene. I can't explain what it is, but there's a love shared between us. But when it shifts into ownership, out of fear or something, or part of the scene that you're in, it starts to find a reason. Some accident happens, some situation happens, but it cannot be false. Somehow, what you're sharing now is coming from a true space. If you visit John in the hospital, it's you visiting John in the hospital. And it's pretty clear that it may not even have a literal space to it, but it has a friendship, and that you've shared that space. So let's say that the life has been creative for you, but then the person who doesn't have that feeling for you or that history with you sees you as suspect in the situation. What kind of weird, two weird dudes singing songs to each other? Okay, so let's say to the family you look pretty weird. Do you agree to that, Derek? That there's different kinds of weird, but all of you look pretty weird. And all of you saying, no, we want John, we'll pay, we'll do this. And they say, he's got a weird group of people. Okay. In San Francisco that speak up for him. They say, well, what are they? Are they gay? Are they short? Are they tall? What the hell's the story with them? I said, I can't tell if they're gay. I don't think John is gay. But it's weird. Would you agree if you were a family member and you were looking at the situation that John was in, that it would somehow sound pretty weird?
Yeah, the onslaught of care for John must be overwhelming in that kind of situation.
Okay, and then you say, from this you earn a living? And you say, well, what does he do? And they say, he does the same thing he always did. He was singing songs all the damn time. So he's still singing songs. They just know him as somebody who bugged them all the time singing songs. Okay. And insisting on the songs having meaning when they wanted him to get a job. So they thought that he used singing as a way of getting out of working. It may be accurate. They may be accurate. Okay. So let's say it's weird than to see friends come in the story where they haven't shared the situation that you've had with John.
Mhm.
They have a different history entirely of very heavy people, each with strong personalities, who generally yell at each other. Even before they speak, they yell. Okay. And I say, am I stereotyping the situation a little bit? I say, a little bit, but that does happen. Okay. So let's say I'll send Carrie, let's invent this script where we send Carrie immediately into a situation like this. How do you think he'll do, Derek?
Mm.
Should he dye his hair blonde?
I don't know if that would do it.
Should he act Italian?
Frosted tips. Hey.
Hey, Baba, hey. No, like a street Italian kind of stereotype,
That'd be tough to do.
Euro taxi driver kind of thing. No. Okay, so then Carrie goes in as a normal white person.
I did a little acting. I was casted as ethnically ambiguous.
Well, let's say that Carrie will go into the situation as an unemployed, normal white person. You want to try it, Carrie?
I kind of did.
Yeah. Let's say the very thing that they used to fight with John about, that he has no job and that he was singing all the time. Now he finds people who are singing all the time, who have no jobs. So it's a very funny thing. There's no have to in it at all. But you're assuming different roles in order to navigate a situation. But the one thing that allowed you entree is the kind of feeling that you shared for John. And that feeling can sometimes explode and sometimes be attracted. But it somehow has given you an expression, that interaction, where both of you are unemployed. And it does seem like unemployment forever is the motto that runs to it.
Right.
What do you say? That somehow your life is your work. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Now that sometimes has wishful thinking, it has magical thinking, it has logical thinking. And let's say when you have relationships then that come out of magical thinking and wishful thinking, and then they literalize then into literal thinking, when in fact much of it came out of wishful thinking, and anyone could have taken DNA samples of each other and told you don't do this, do that. You understand? Could have predicted the future that was inherent in this mixture of DNA. But let's say that there were certain experiences waiting in the circumstance for you that entered into your memory and into your life. And you see the different films that you've been in. That somehow where you were devoted to this, or you were that, or you were a worker, or you had that son, that was your job. And you could even see films accidentally now that kind of resemble situations that you were in or are in, but seen from the perspective of the art of it. So you see even all the elements that were written into the story were kind of creatively waiting there. Because in fact, there are creative challenges. That thought is a medium of figuring out. But then there is also a dimension where in the creative, it's not around figuring it out. It's around seeing something. Because I say why? Because the figure outer is a possessive still of the story. So let's say that something in the story is hidden from you because there is a lack of perspective that you will only discover in time. But if in fact the interest is in fact that the life that you're living in fact is a creative process, it's not do or don't. You see that you then, the confusions and everything like that, the failures, they were not exactly failures. They were part of a creative process that was ensuring a kind of freedom, but not licensed, not a vulgar freedom, not a freedom of a gun or a weapon, but that essentially you see that there is an integrity in the life, and that somehow the situations you're in have to be true. And it's not spelled out, but it does spell out when it's not true. And you cannot get away with pretending to be a prisoner. Is that okay? That you cannot get away with being a prisoner of the story. If you're now in it, even though it may look like you're forced into it, it is a creative act on your part, just coming from who you are. Is that you may find it challenging to convey something, but you're not avoiding conveying that thing. In one sense, you see, it's not built on avoidance. There is inherently that are kind of living together intimately at one moment has a honest conversation waiting in it. When it naturalizes or literalizes, then you see that there's an event waiting that has a baby, do you still want to do this thing? That somehow the next phase of it, the people must be on board with each other. Because as we're becoming aware of living and dying as the sentiment that's running through the story, then that is in fact what is happening. And you see that lots of experiences happen to you that happen in the dying that can't happen to you in the living. But in the almost dying, you see it kind of reveals another dimension of what you would have had in memory. When there's no one to fight with and no one to remember in the literal sense, but only the dying was in the picture, it then revealed the hidden dimensions of relationship, past the survival dimensions of relationship. So you see that the survival dimensions of life has hidden a whole parallel existence, because there is a whole existence that has very little to do with the survival of the self. But that availability to that parallel life comes only when there is a certain experience that one is in, or a feeling that one is in, because it's a death experience to the self. To experience that somehow you've flown over this life and that you've assumed different identities towards the experiences. And that somehow it's almost as if you, in flying over the life, you then saw something and you assumed an identity to have an experience. But your relationship was with the integrity of flying over, that you're not literally any of those characters, you're assuming those characters towards the experience. And that somehow the people that you've met, they may be students, we can call them different names, but somehow there has been some characters, a group of people that shared a common feeling, that speak a common language when they meet, even though their experiences are very different from each other. And that somehow you see, even though there is still a conversation that's a challenge, you see that somehow everyone knew what everyone found out in time. That somehow there is a continuum, but that when the message comes across, you start to see it's not, it just reveals something that somehow we managed. You see then that one is managing maybe 5 or 10 lives at once and has normalized it. And that also one is keeping a very private life going. that may be made sneaky if it has to hide, but it is not sneaky by nature. It is a creative life, meaning it doesn't belong to you. There is a spiritual life running through the story. And it has a different relationship with the world than the literal identity does. That energy is, there is something seeking, not in the literal term, but that there is, it seems, another dimension of its own existence in the circumstance. And that comes when there is a love affair that recognizes dying as part of it, or being there for an experience. So somehow there is a truth in that that is not spelled out in terms of literalizing the truth, but somehow a shared life, meaning also a shared death. Doesn't mean you have to take care of someone and give them water every 10 minutes, but it does mean that you understand that somehow the feelings that you have transcend the literal life. That somehow you understand that while you're having an affair or a feeling with someone, they're also in your memory. And the memory is not a possessor. The memory has a relationship to a parallel life. So you see, while you were living a literal life, there's also been the parallel experiences that one accesses through memory. So I feel that if you then speak to this fellow Kai, sure, say he's welcome. It's just what's the medium, because this is the medium that we're kind of creating, where living and dying are inherently in the friendships conversation. So we can kid around and we can be specific at times, where some friends will have a specific where there's literally dying is right there immediately. But we're also experiencing not that the illness or the circumstance created the dying, it reveals the dying process. So there are elements that reveal a dying and living process, and that there is an intuition around it. But once it's revealed, it then becomes part of your common sense. You see a deeper dimension in things that was there, we'll say, in the Hippocratic Oath, where you then had to do no harm. That if you were going to see certain things, you had to become human. Meaning human would come from a human space, would do no harm. The self would come from a survival space. So there was always an attempt to humanize the being. That the human then assumes an identity. That is different than the identity assumes human expressions or whatever for itself. But that one comes from that place. That is what we are experiencing when you then experience something from your history, but you discover it, and the discovery kind of frees you from the literal karmic story.
Mm.
You see, you come more from mystery than history. And you start to see that once it's released as mystery, you see other dimensions are awakened in your own life. Once you're given other dimensions, that you see even in the dumbest way, that your parents were they were people who were doing parents. How much was missed by you in relegating them to parents first, that they, okay. So then when you discover them as humans, what anyone else knew, but who happened to be this, you discover a parallel circumstance, not that you don't only come from a history, you come from a mystery. And the mystery can be as simple as boy meets girl and falling in love. And then creating a life that looks normal, but then you see the mystery inherently in the story. And then you see the mystery running through your own life. And you see how powerful a force it has been in your life. So I feel that once that is added to the life as second nature, then you're considering that dimension of your existence, not only your survival, but you're kind of investigating whether it's true or not. And true is a whole different thing than it was before. True is that you do not have to be ashamed of being human. There's a difference between discretion and hiding. There's a difference between something being that one needed to be in a certain state to share. So you start to discover dimensions that run through your life. So when this fellow is asking questions about a sentiment that doctor may have had, and he's then talking about a condition, and ironically, he's talking about a condition that some of us are in and are having conversations about. We've then attempted to create an immersive environment where in everyday kidding around conversations and serious conversations, we're kind of experiencing living and dying as being in the moment, not only an eventual state of death, but a process that is happening. And in seeing that perceptively, then we're seeing that death itself is a process. But without perceiving the living and dying in the everyday, in every breath, then death is a finality to us that becomes a threat. But in seeing the process of living and dying, then death is an aspect of the experience, not a finality in that way. So when logic controls it, death is a finality. When perception introduced to the story, then death is a doorway of perception that somehow frees the literalness of the story, where it's pure energy. So the premise of our literal story is continuity. The premise of the energy is that we are visiting the body and having an experience. And that it comes across mostly as nature, where you see pollen and you see fruit and you see wintertime and branches, and you see a process happening. And what looks like the ending with just plain branches, all of a sudden you start to see it harvest again. So you start to see an interactive. So in the literal form, death is a finality. In the aspect of the creative dimension, the dying process perceived changes death from a literalness into another dimension of experience. And that means, I think, even in memory, you're reached in memory. You have a conversation in memory. I'm seeing from the perspective of a creative life, the multi-dimensional aspects of the life. And then I feel that once you see it from that perspective, you can re-enter the story, and you have different tools available in perspective, where you have magic available. What's considered magic was in fact a way of seeing something. And you see that all of the elements had some meaning. Screwing up had great meaning. It was the basis of great learning. Failures were important because then one studied deeper or looked deeper or explored deeper. So you start to see dimensions running through the life that were hidden in plain sight, but make each life a sort of miracle in terms of, okay. But as it becomes a possessive, it normalizes. So if in fact you see that part of the life was written beforehand, and we do know that in menstruation and that the kids becoming adults in order to, and they're trained and geared to have families and futures or whatever. So you see to some degree it was written in the body, and that there's an environment around you that's protecting you, sharing you, creating for you, organizing you around that premise. But it's still a confusion to you while you're in it, where the world can see you in a certain way. you find out. And when you find out about it, there's an aha moment
Mm.
that there were forces that were running the story. I think when you perceive it or discover it, you change the relationship of your connection to the past, where the past is not repeating itself in you any longer once you discover it. You see that you come more from mystery than history. As it is perceived, it releases you from a literal history to an evocative history. And so you see then that the world then becomes a creative expression for you, which is not exactly repetitious. It may have the perfume of a mother or a memory of a father in it, but it is no longer repeating the story.
Yeah.
So in the creative act, you're not bringing children up to have a career move. You're bringing children up to be essentially creatively free, to find their voice.
Mhm.
That their expression is waiting, it's not given beforehand. So that meant born free, that they were not born to carry out karmically a repetition, but they were born to kind of explore the life and the different dimensions of it. So you can see early on in their interest that they are interested in the larger things, the meanings of the world, what is going on here, or whatever, you see. Okay. So I feel that that is happening, that the children that come out of some of our friendships are kind of born free to discover themselves. Not as licensed behavior, but as human. Whereas generally the karmic situation is that you have a career waiting for them beforehand, that they have to have jobs and you're training them to have jobs.
Mhm.
No, you kind of, it may be naive to the rest of the world when they look at your teaching, but you see that you're teaching them to be free human beings. And that to come from some space in themselves while they're living their life. So I think that somehow it is implanted in them that there is a life, there is a grace being lived. So in going out into the world, I think that they are bringing a dimension to the story. So I feel that that's what's happening, but that may also be, you'll have challenges like coming your way. Should you have medical advice or do this? Should it go be literalized in the school? So you'll have questions where you're not wanting it to be so organized, but not so divorced. You want it to be hip enough to navigate through that world.
Yeah.
Hmm?
Yeah.
But still it's making kind of creative choices for itself. Okay, so then you'll call the fellow, and I think his name is Willem.
Wayne. I think.
Oh,
Wayne.
Wayne. Gee, I'm trying to remember if I've met the fellow or not,
I'll ask him.
or if he met, because he said he met. So sure, say he's welcome, and we'll touch base, but try to find out what situation it's on. Okay.
Okay. All right.
Should it be invited to come online or something? Well, you'll figure that out. Okay.
Okay.
See if that's because even though it's normal now meeting on Wednesday, there is something happening, and we have been sharing. Everyone's had an intense time of it.
Mm-hmm.
This year and a half has been a very deep and weird time, but it also has its beauty.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely.
That the virus solves certain kinds of momentary issues for us.
Mm.
Of kind of just hanging out, and hanging out became normal. Let's hang out for another year or so, or this or that. So this idea that somehow you can say to the body, let's do a year, and somehow the body agrees with you or whatever. Okay, and we've made it simplistic sounding, but I also feel it happens to be true when there's a friendly, that somehow there can be a friendly conversation with the ordeal itself.
Mm.
Okay, I'll see some of you tomorrow night or Sunday. Take
Thanks,
care.
Joan.
Take care, everyone. Namaste. And I think that Spiro had an operation and he's
Oh, okay.
okay.
That's good. It's sober.
A little complicated, but he'll be all right.
A little complicated, but he'll be
Oh.
okay.
Okay. Good to know.
So and again, what Marty called today, and he was a lot better than he was. You know, that he's going to Italy to hang out for a while. So we'll see how it's going.
Okay.
Take care.
Thanks, Danny.
Bye
Bye.
bye.